Most people think the next global crisis will come from oil. They are wrong. If something goes wrong in the Strait of Hormuz, it will not just hit gas prices. It could slow down artificial intelligence, disrupt chip production, and shake the entire stock market. And almost no one is connecting the dots. Every single day, about 20% of the world's oil passes through a narrow strip of water called the Strait of Hormuz. So the common belief is simple. If this choke point gets disrupted, the global economy collapses. That used to be true, but today, that story is outdated. 20 years ago, an oil shock hit the United States hard. Why? Because the US imported about 60% of its oil. When supply was disrupted, prices spiked, inflation surged, and the economy slowed down. But today, that world no longer exists. Over the past 2 decades, new drilling technologies unlocked massive oil reserves. Production surged, and today, the United States is the largest oil producer in the world. Now, here's the part most people miss. Most of the oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz does not go to the United States. The majority goes to Asia. Countries like China, India, Japan, and South Korea depend heavily on that flow. Together, they account for the vast majority of the oil passing through the strait. So if disruption happens, the impact is not equal. The United States faces a price problem. Asia faces a supply problem. And those are not the same thing. Price problems hurt. Supply problems break economies. Factories slow down. Energy gets rationed. Production stalls. Entire systems start to crack. But before you think the United States is safe, there's a catch. Actually, 2. First, the US produces mostly light crude oil, but its refineries were built to process heavy crude. For decades, America imported heavy oil from countries like Venezuela and Mexico. That system never fully changed. So even today, the US exports much of its light oil and imports the type it actually needs, which means a disruption still affects what the US can refine at home. Second, oil is globally priced, so when prices spike, they rise everywhere. Gas becomes more expensive, shipping costs increase, and that cost gets passed down into almost everything people buy. So even if the US produces more oil, ordinary people still feel the pain. Now here's where the story gets bigger. Oil is only half the picture. About 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas also flows through the Strait of Hormuz. If that supply gets disrupted, global energy markets tighten even further. And here's the twist. The United States has quietly become the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world. So while some regions lose supply, others step in to sell it. Scarcity doesn't just create risk, it creates opportunity. But most people stop there, and that's a mistake, because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a choke point for oil and gas. It's also critical for something most people never think about: helium. Helium is essential for manufacturing advanced semiconductors, the same chips that power artificial intelligence. Without helium, chip production becomes extremely difficult. Not impossible, but slower, more expensive, and far less efficient. And here's the chain reaction almost no one is talking about. If the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted, helium supply tightens. That slows down chip production, which slows down the development of artificial intelligence, which puts pressure on the stock market. This is no longer just an energy story. It's a technology story. It's a financial system story. Now let's talk about China. China is the largest importer of oil in the world. It depends heavily on energy flowing through global trade routes, including the Strait of Hormuz. And to be fair, China saw this risk coming. They diversified suppliers, they built strategic reserves, and they expanded imports from countries like Russia and Brazil. So in the short term, they can absorb a disruption. But in the medium to long term, the situation becomes more serious because China's entire economic engine runs on energy. Manufacturing, exports, industrial production, all of it depends on a constant and reliable energy supply. If that flow slows down, pressure builds quickly. What starts as a disruption becomes a structural problem. Now, here's another layer most people ignore. If energy prices stay high for long enough, countries are forced to accelerate the shift towards renewable energy. That sounds like a good thing, but it creates a long-term threat for traditional energy producers, because high prices today can reduce demand tomorrow. In other words, the same spike that creates profits now can quietly destroy future growth. And there's one more effect. The United States imports a massive amount of goods from Asia: electronics, clothing, machinery. If energy costs rise in Asia, production becomes more expensive, and those higher costs get passed down to American consumers. So even if the US is more energy independent, it's still deeply connected to the global system. And when that system gets stressed, everyone feels it. Now let's go back to artificial intelligence. There's growing evidence that the productivity gains from AI may be smaller than many expected. Some estimates suggest gains of only 2 to 4%. At the same time, markets have poured massive amounts of money into AI infrastructure. So here's the risk. If AI growth is already overhyped and chip production slows down because of supply constraints like helium, then the entire investment story becomes fragile. And if that story cracks, markets react fast. So when you zoom out, something interesting appears. This is not just about oil. It's not just about gas. It's not even just about technology. It's about power. At the same time tensions rise around the Strait of Hormuz, the relationship between the United States and China is already under pressure. Trade conflicts, technology restrictions, supply chain shifts, all of it has been building for years. So ask yourself this: if one country can tolerate an economic shock while another faces structural pressure, what does that create? Leverage. And that means the Strait of Hormuz is not just a choke point for resources, it's a choke point for global power. So here are 3 questions to think about. What happens if supply disruptions hit both the Strait of Hormuz and major heavy oil suppliers at the same time? What happens if helium shortages slow down artificial intelligence more than expected? And what happens if the AI boom is more fragile than investors believe? Because if those things start to happen, then this is not just another energy scare. It's the early signal of a much bigger shift. And most people aren't paying attention. If you want to understand how money, power, and the global system really work, subscribe to My Father's Wallet, because the biggest opportunities come from seeing what others miss.